Hey, all right, we're on. Morning, everybody, or anybody who's left. Apologize for the delay here this morning. The agronomist forgot to update the laptop. Jennifer has asked me to make a habit out of. I have lots of habits. I need some healthy habits. A healthy habit would be to update the laptop periodically. Generally, it rides around in the back seat of my truck for 2 weeks before the next ATA, and the only thing we use this laptop for is ATA. So it's not turned on frequently. Doesn't get a chance to update, do its thing. It is feeling and acting much better now that it's had a chance to do an update. So, good morning, Adam and I here with you from the Nutrient Studios, just south of Macomb. Beautiful fall weather here lately. I love that this is good fat guy weather as I call it. So very very comfortable. Did you get the harvest moon last night? I believe that harvest moon would be an accurate term for that. I was out in the field last night. We quit harvesting corn about 10. I'm going to pull up a picture here and see if this comes through. But you almost did not need lights to be in the field last night. And there it is. So, believe it or not, I took that picture at 10 o'clock last night. The combine lights are not on. The orb you see at the top of the picture is in fact the moon. And that is no flash, no photo editing, no. I mean, it literally looked like that last night at 10 o'clock. So, anyway, pretty cool. Been lots of cool astrological things. There was a comet this week. We had the Northern Lights last week. For if you're kind of into that kind of stuff, been a lot of cool things going on. So, Adam and I wanted to talk about several things here this morning. I've got a list up here behind me. Top of the list is yield variability. We'll talk about that. I'll click off a few things real quick just to make sure I don't forget them. So yield chaser reminder, you've still got time to get your yield chaser entries in. So talk to your dealer, talk to your FSR if you're not sure how to do that. The easy way to do it is a 10-acre field region report in climate. The slightly harder, but still really easy way to do it is to weigh an acre and a quarter through some sort of scale and go with that. If you do the 10-acre field region report, I would ask one thing of you. Make sure you do a post-harvest calibration on your data. We trust you. It's an honor system. You're not going to win $1 million if you win this contest, so it's not worth cheating. So make sure your data is pretty accurate. You don't have to have the most perfectly calibrated yield monitor. I don't, honestly, but I do keep track of what comes off of every farm, and then I go back in and post-harvest calibrate all of my yield data before I actually use the yield data. So anyway, get your yield chaser entries in. We've got a lot of entries coming in. We hope to see a lot more. I think the deadline for that is December 15th. Adam, does that sound right?
Yes, I believe that's
yeah.
Right.
So December 15th is the deadline, and don't do what I do. You go, oh well, that's 2 months away. What's the rush? Treat the deadline like it's tomorrow. Just get it done, get it taken care of, and then you won't be scrambling around on December 14th. And, oh crap, how do I get that yield chaser entry in? The other thing, I want to give Jennifer Elliott a shout out for all the things that she does for us from a technology standpoint. So this YouTube page that we're on now, that's kind of Jennifer's baby. She takes care of all of that, and on there, you'll find all sorts of agronomic content. Now, Kal-Al and I may be generating the content, but she's the one that gets it on, online, gets it in a usable format. So every year, Kal-Al and I get together and we go to a big plot. Generally, it's Jennifer's dad's plot south of Monmouth. And, he plants a huge plot. Almost the entire lineup of products is there. And so it gives Chris and I an opportunity to walk through the entire lineup in one field. and we tell you what we like and what we don't like, and how to use and how not to use at least all of our key products. And we assume the older ones that you've been using for years, you probably know how to use those. But we have a good time doing that every year. We have a little bit of fun. It's a tremendous amount of work to get those videos uploaded and get them posted on YouTube. And Jennifer got that done. So if you want a quick refresher from Chris and I's point of view on key attributes of products and how to use them and where to use them, virtually everything we say is in the seed guide. And I like to point out to people that we spend a lot of time every year putting together what we feel is a good seed guide that has a lot of good information in it. And then we recreate the wheel throughout the year in different ways because people tend to not use the seed guide. So, we're probably never going to quit doing a seed guide, but I do wish that people would use the one we do more. So a lot of the information is in that seed guide as well. And then the last thing I'll mention, just a little bit of a teaser. So I do earlier this year when I was at Dr. Belo's field day, crop physiology field day in early August. I think that was maybe the 1st of August, actually, Adam, if you remember. I know you were there. So anyway, at that, Dr. Belo very graciously asked and offered to be our guest again on our season-ending final episode of Ask the Agronomist. So we don't have a date set for that. We always got to work around Dr. Belo's schedule with class and such, but it's going to be somewhere, mid-December prior to Christmas-ish. So I haven't even looked at the calendar to see what our regularly scheduled date. Adam might be doing that as we speak, just to throw out some possible dates. But very, very happy. I actually was a little bit sheepish about asking, because this will be the 3rd year in a row that we've had Dr. Belo on for the final episode. And it's always the best episode of the year. Both Adam and I go way back with Dr. Belo, and anytime we get a chance to spend time with Dr. Belo, it's a pleasure and a treat and a lot of fun. And he's a super, super, super busy guy, super sought after, still teaching, still got lots of students going on, still doing lots of research. He's a tremendously gifted speaker, so always in demand for speaking. And so very pleased when he actually inquired about, the season ending episode and if we wanted to have him on again. And I was like, absolutely, we do. So we're working on that, get the details of that out. And what are those dates, Adam? In December, what would be our normal Thursdays?
Our normal Thursday would be the 12th, probably be the 12th, because the 26th would be the other day. Yeah,
right. So somewhere around the 12th, probably. Look for that season ending episode and more to come on that. So I think that's all of the
producer. Yes. Jennifer is scolding me and wants me to correct. This is a fact check here.
Okay.
It's December 10th, not the 15th. Yield chasers.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well,
got some fact checking going on.
All right. Okay.
We apologize for that.
That's by these days standards, that's a pretty small lie. But yes, December 10th is the actual date. So the main part of what Adam and I said, treat the deadline like it's tomorrow, that's still true. So if you get your entry in, it doesn't matter whether it's the 1st, 10th, or 15th, because you got it done. So let's go with that. So thank you, Jennifer, for the fact check. We know she's watching. All right. So I got a whole bunch of pictures of stuff. Actually made a little folder to keep these pictures in. I thought we might want to use this morning, and I need to so I'm a big fall burn down guy, so I was in a field of corn the other day, and lo and behold, what's growing there on that ground. So we've got lots of winter annual weeds already emerged out there. Now, sometimes when you harvest, you cover those up a little bit with some of the residue. So I actually don't really prefer to chase the combine around with the sprayer. I'd kind of like things to melt down a little bit. I'd kind of like to get a rain on it. I don't know if it still rains around here or not, but I'd kind of like to get a rain on that stuff, let that stuff grow up through the residue a little bit. I think when you chase the combine around with your fall burn down, you do miss a few things because they're covered by a corn shuck, or they're covered enough with something that you don't get great coverage. So, I prefer a little bit of a later fall burn down myself. That's just me. I'm not a retail applicator, and I understand the retail application world. You need to get stuff done, and if you're trying to do fall fertilizer, fall ammonia, fall burn down, fall this, fall that, you run out of fall. So it's more important that you do it than when you do it, or even what you do it with. Even if you went out there with some cheap, close to worthless 2,4-D, that would be better than nothing. Just something to kill some of those winter annuals and get a nice, relatively clean field in the spring is what we're trying to accomplish with our fall burn down. You don't have to be fancy. You don't have to use residuals. You don't have to spend $20 an acre on products to do a good fall burn down. 2,4-D dicamba works great. 2,4-D and Roundup works great. Roundup dicamba works great. Some guys don't like to use Roundup in their fall burn down because they want to be able to be a little sloppy with the sprayer. They want to spray through waterways, and I get that. Don't spray through your waterways if you got Roundup in the tank. Now, with some of the technology and bordering fields and all the automatic stuff that we have today, it's a little easier to be a spray guy than it used to be because the sprayer is doing a lot of the work for you. But I think that fall burn downs are better when Roundup is in the tank, but you don't have to have it. So don't talk yourself out of doing it because you are doing something that you feel is too expensive. It's worth doing. Pick something that you feel is affordable and get it done. We talked about this 2 weeks ago. Remember back in the spring how much you wished you'd done a fall burn down last year. Now it's dry, so the dryness might be slowing down some germination and emergence of winter annual weeds. But my guess is not very much. They're going to find enough moisture. They're going to do what they do. This is an early harvest. Early falls tend to make winter annuals worse because you've got more sunlight. You've got better growing conditions for them once the crop is removed. So, typically the earliness of this year, the earliness of this harvest, you've probably seen how green some of the early harvested fields have gotten with corn and soybeans volunteer growing in the fields. Winter annuals are no different. They're going to take advantage of this early fall as well and make for some beautifully green and purple fields next spring, which are pretty to look at if you're not the guy farming the field. I think Adam's wife is a photographer. She looks forward to the sea of purple every spring because
she really appreciates everybody not spraying.
That's right. That's right. You could write a message in a field of henbit if you wanted to, and make a nice mural out of your farm. So anyway, get your fall burn downs done. My dealer called me last week, wanted to know if I was going to do fall burn down this year, and I thought, what a silly question. Hell yes, I'm doing fall burn down this year. I haven't decided what one, but we're doing it. Okay, so we got yield chasers checked off. We got fall burn down. We did product videos, year-end episode. Okay, so I'm just kind of randomly going through my list here. Let's talk about the yield impact of soybean moisture. So Adam and I were going to spend some time talking about variability of yield. And I would say this year, good beans are 80 plus something. Disappointing beans are 60 plus something. I would say there's about a 20 bushel yield gap between what I'd call the good beans and what I'd call the disappointing beans. Not that 60 is a disaster. You know, there's some places where the bad beans are in the 40s. We haven't had too many yields that low, but there's been a lot of people that heard about 80s and 90s and maybe even 100. And when you dip into some 63 or some 67, which 10 years ago you'd have been pretty happy with that. That doesn't feel as good today as it did 10 years ago. And you're wondering, well, where's my other 20 bushel? So things that are robbing yield from soybeans would be planting date is a big one. Fungicide, disease. We'll say harvest moisture, and I'll throw management in here too. And management would include, you know, variety and fertility, other thing, and then obviously this one should be at the top of the list, you know, weather, and weather impacts this one heavily. You know, also maturity.
Yes.
And these two interact with that one, you know, and Adam spent a lot of time with Dr. Belo studying interactions, and a lot of Dr. Belo's work is how these different things interact with each other. But there is a huge, you know, I'm going to say 10 plus bushel planting date variability this year, with, you know, obviously April being better than May.
Which is because of the corresponding weather associated with the planting day.
Yes. And so Adam's comment is sometimes people can't hear Adam. That, you know, the weather is a big part of why the planting date happens, because the weather was better for the earlier planted crops. It was true of corn as well in most cases. Maturity, same thing. The weather was better for earlier beans. We're not seeing really any advantage. Sometimes it's a disadvantage to full season soybeans this year, which is genetically weird. Early beans are not better, but if it doesn't rain enough late for the full season bean to take advantage of the fact that it has more yield potential, you don't get to see the more yield because it didn't get the right weather that it needed. And in lots of places, so I know on my farm where my disappointing beans are, my April was wet and with big rains. So even my April planted beans were pretty mediocre. You know, low 70s was where I topped out. And then May, June were generally dry. It's not the end of the world. July was wet. And then August and September, dry again. So we were at times too wet, at times too dry. And for soybeans, the worst time to be wet would be early in the season. And the best time to be wet would be late in the season. We were exactly the opposite of that in many cases. And the resulting, you know, disease issues that sometimes came up, and not always sudden death, not always white mold, although I think I got a picture of this. There was, in some cases, a lot of white mold around this year. So standing at the auger, grabbing white mold sclerotia out of my grain sample as they're going into the bin. So I try to sell as many sclerotia as I can. So every load of beans I send to export is going to have sclerotia and as much weed seed as I can get in there, because the other alternative is you put them back out in the field, and that's the last place you want any of that kind of crap. But that was a May 19th planted early group 3 bean, and apparently the timing of the flowering, the timing of the moisture, the timing of the spores of white mold being released from the little teacup mushroom that grows up and shoots the spores up into the canopy, had a lot of white mold infection, and that was one of the yield limiting factors in that particular field. So I'll have to be a little bit careful, 2 years from now, and 4 years from now, and 6 years from now, when that field goes back to beans. Might want to keep white mold in mind. But there's a lot of what I call secondary diseases that are more of an issue this year in soybeans. So things like pod and stem blight, things like stem canker, things like the diaporthy species that we talk a lot about. There's a disease called zone lines, which is very prevalent. There's probably some charcoal rot out there. I'm going to talk about zone lines versus charcoal rot here, because there's been some changing schools of thought in the pathology world about what is charcoal rot and what is not charcoal rot. And you can get varying different opinions on stuff. But when you are traveling through a field of beans in the combine, I got a really good picture of this from one of my fields. Yeah. So see that line up ahead there in the distance where they go from kind of dark gray to lighter colored, and almost looks like maybe they're standing a little bit better. Those really black ones right in front of me here in the foreground of that picture are making about 50. The lighter colored ones up there are doing about 80. The black ones here are full of dead leaves. And if you were looking up close at them, you could see that plant didn't really mature. It just died. And if you start splitting stems in areas like that in your field, you're going to find stems. Can you see those little black lines? It looks almost like a topographic map down there or a contour map down there towards the bottom of that root. That's what we call zone lines. That gets misdiagnosed by a lot of people as charcoal rot. And we actually used to think that was charcoal rot. And just to prove it, there's a picture from a very reputable diagnostic guide that's a few years old. And what's it say that is? Charcoal rot. So there is some differential opinion of what charcoal rot is and what charcoal rot is not. But regardless of whether that's charcoal rot, zone lines, some of both, something else that hasn't even been named yet, when you split a stem and you see any black of any kind, whether it's just kind of general grayed off or it's the distinct lines, that's all bad. And that plant's also loaded with pod and stem blight. That plant may also have anthracnose. That plant may also have several other pathogens working on it. It might not have ever showed sudden death. It might not have white mold. It might not have BSR. So we get pretty focused on the big three. And to me, the big three are SDS, white mold, BSR. And a lot of people would say, well, I got these dead spots in my field where yields 20, 30 bushel less than the rest of the field, and I never saw sudden death there. Well, it may not be sudden death, but there's 16 other things that it could be. And a lot of these, they're considered secondary pathogens because they're typically associated with multiple different diseases, multiple different stresses. And the one stress that we know that almost all soybeans had this year was it was too dry during grain fill. And the places that caught a little more rain during grain fill, that's where the 90 and 100 bushel beans are. And there's less of the disease issues there. Places where beans are in the 60s and 70s, you've got healthy spots in fields making 80 plus, but you got these dead spots in fields making 50, and you end up with a kind of modest 65 to 70 bushel average yield for the field. And beans are incredibly dusty this year. I think the poorer they are, the dustier they are, and that's because when the when the plant just dies, and you got all the petioles and all the leaves and all the trash just hanging up in there, and all that stuff goes through the combine after it's half decomposed just from old age and laying out there. It just gets ground into dust, and it just looks like you must be eating dirt with that combine because there is so much dust. I know on a still night in a river bottom area or a low area, someplace where there's no air movement, I mean, you absolutely have to have guidance, and you just have to trust there's nothing wrong with your cutter bar, and trust that there's nothing laying out there that you're worried about running into the head, because you literally can't see your hand in front of your face in a bean field at night if there's no breeze. And if the breeze is moving the wrong way and it's moving the direction you are, and it's a nice 5-mile-an-hour breeze, and you're going about 4.5 mile an hour, you can't see anything, going one way, and you've got perfect visibility going the other way. So just tremendously dusty. Seeing a lot of these, I'll call them minor diseases. We call diseases minor. If it's in your field, it's kind of a major thing. But a lot of this secondary stuff like pod and stem blight, charcoal rot, zone lines, stem canker, the diaporthy diseases, aren't necessarily considered to be, big time issues like brown stem rot, like sudden death, like white mold. But they do nip at the heels of your yield, and it's pretty easy if 3 or 4 of those diseases working together kills your soybean plant 3 weeks before it was ready. It's a little bit like what crown rot does to corn. The kernel does not finish well. You get smaller kernels. You get lighter kernels. You don't get fewer kernels, because when the plant was determining how many kernels it was going to have, it felt fine. Some of these soybean plants are loaded with pods, but they might not have 3 beans in them. Maybe they started as 3 and aborted down to 2, or maybe they started as 3 and aborted down to 1, or maybe they've got all 3, but the seed's 50% smaller than it would have been had that plant lived a full normal life. And you could see as soybeans started to turn that not all was well in the soybean world, because you didn't see fields that got yellow and then dropped leaves. It's just like one day they're green, the next day they're kind of brownish green, and the day after that they're brown. And yeah, you might see some yellow, but there's more brown than yellow. And they just didn't mature the way a healthy plant matures. Now, Adam and I were having a conversation about we are in a high yield environment this year. The environment that we had was conducive to high yields, but we did have stresses, and some of the stresses were environmental, some of the stresses were disease oriented, and because we're in a high yield environment, that's why the bad beans are making 65. If we were in a low yield environment, the bad beans would be making 35. So the fact that the bottom end of bean yields is in the 60s is an indication that we had a pretty high yield environment this year, but it wasn't the perfect yield environment. If you had the perfect yield environment, that's where the 90 plus bushel beans are coming from. And even in those perfect environments, we're seeing the big difference between April and May. If you're in an environment where if your April beans made 90, your May beans probably still making 70. If your April beans made 75, then your May beans might get a little sketchy, because there is a big, no matter what yield level you're at, there's a big difference between April and May this year in soybeans, probably bigger than normal difference. And if you had early beans early and full season beans late, which is fairly common, that's what I would recommend you do. I don't like planting my full season beans first. I want to plant my early beans first. So if you planted your 2.7s or your 3.0s or your 3.3s first in April, and you finished with your 3.9s in May, your 3.9s at a huge disadvantage to the 3.3s that you planted in April because of planting date and maturity. And normally, I would say a 3.9 should out yield a 3.3, but it's sure not going to this year if the 3.3 got planted first and the 3.9 got planted later. All other things being equal, obviously soil type, field differences, even yield history differences on farms. So if you've got farms that historically raise good beans, that's just a different environment than the farm that historically hasn't raised good beans. And I've got a producer I work with that, he typically he's got a lot of hog manure. Beans love manure. I think beans love manure more than corn does. Manure causes more problems in corn than it does benefits a lot of times. But I've almost became I'd rather have my manure on my bean ground guy, which is a little bit of waste of the nitrogen that's in manure. But we'll save that subject for another day. But this guy's had, he's had fields pushing 100. He's got, every field he's been in has 100 bushel spots in it. If you got a field that averages 90, somewhere out there you had 100 bushel soybeans, because almost every field has at least 20 bushel yield variability in across the field. And, my fields that made 72, had spots that were in the upper 80s. So there's always a range out there. But I pointed out to this guy, he said, well, why are my beans better than other people's? I'm like, well, your beans are usually better than other people's. Now they're better than they usually are, even for him, because he's in a high yield environment. He caught some rains in August that not everybody got. He got all his beans planted in April. He's a plant beans first guy. Now, the plant beans first guys are raising better beans. The plant corn first guys are raising better corn this year. So if you have to pick and choose which crop you plant first, I'm still going to say plant your beans first for lots of reasons. But the guys that like to plant corn early, they're going to be able to crow about, having the best corn this year as well. So this was a very good year to be equipped, have enough equipment and manpower to plant both crops early. Not everybody can do that. I can't do that on my farm. I have to make my choices, and I'm going to stick with my plant beans first. But this year was a good year to plant both crops first if you have the capability of doing that.
Hey, Lance, maybe along that same line, I know we're talking about beans there, but you mentioned the dustiness of the beans.
Yeah.
How dry some of the beans have gotten, all that. We've all had comments, conversations about head fluff with corn as well.
Yeah.
Dry corn and all that. Maybe if you could weigh in on that a little bit. There's been a couple of comments come to me that would like a little bit of discussion around that.
Yeah, and I don't honestly know what the solution to that is. The corn is obvious. Everything's too dry. We got guys harvesting. My dad's dumping trucks at the elevator in the fall for a part-time job. He's getting corn in that's 13. There's been beans that were 8.5. The humidity levels we've had are so low. A lot of the days we've had are so warm. We got more warm weather coming next week. Supposed to be back up in the mid 70s. And when it's dry for extended periods of time, it's really hard to get. Now I was in some 6618 2 days ago. This would have been May 19th planted. It was half green, 22% still. But that's pretty late planted corn, and it's hard to get everything out of the field before it gets really, really, really dry. And if you've got a plant that's still fairly intact, meaning the leaves are still on it, which we like plants that are intact, because if they're not intact, they're disintegrating and they might be laying on the ground. So when you've got a lot of that fodder there and it's dry, it does get kind of fluffy. Ironically, I think old metal heads don't have as much trouble with that because there's some static electricity involved in that phenomenon. But we're not all going to go back to old metal heads. So there are some attachments out there that, paddles and stuff to kind of force that stuff into the auger, get it in the machine. I know it can be frustrating. I know it can be a challenge. I've known situations where guys literally could only harvest corn when it was damp in the morning, and when it got super dry, it just became a battle, and it was a battle not worth fighting, just because stuff would fluff in the head. I've heard stories of guys that it's fine going into the wind because the wind's kind of helping shove all that crap back into the auger. The solution to that is to harvest more high moisture corn, but that's easier said than done. I do think years like this, we planted early. It was dry harvest. I think that kind of exacerbates the problem. We could have all planted 120-day corn this year and the world would have been fine. I do think we are going to continue to see, we've seen a trend in recent years. People are looking for more full season corn because corn is getting too dry in the field too fast, and planting more full season corn will help that. Spreading your planting dates out will help that. If you could tolerate planting some corn in May, it would give you more time to harvest your corn before it gets too dry. But you have to tolerate planting corn in May, and some of you just can't do that. I understand that. So, there's a limit to how fast we can get started on it. We could plant some earlier corn and start even earlier. Get to your full season corn quicker because you started earlier. But I just think it's kind of a part of it. I don't like cutting 8.5% beans either. And I know people that they've left beans standing in the field because they're too dry, and they're going to wait, and they're going to cut them after a rain or after we get a change in the weather pattern to where they can cut them at 12, 13, 14%, because it is real money that you're losing when you harvest 9% beans, and you lose two ways because there's more shatter loss. Even the best technology soybean harvesting head in the world is going to have more yield loss at 9% beans than it does at 13 or 14% beans. And then there's simply the water weight that you're losing. And you can do the math on that if you want to, just to calculate what it is. So I'll show you how to do that. So if you harvest soybeans that, let's say they made 75 bushel at 9%. So what would that have been at 13%? So you can, if you want, so sometimes there's math you don't want to do. I've done 1 year. I only did this once. People told me not to, but I did it anyway. I thought, well, what would I have made if I'd have sold all my corn the way I sold my best corn? Don't do that math. That's depressing. I could have paid off a farm and bought another one. So anyway, so you might call this math depressing too. So if you've got 75 bushel beans times 0.91 divided by 0.87. So at 13%, they would have been 78.4. So that's a 3.4 bushel per acre yield hit, and at, even at, let's be real honest, even at $9 beans, so 3.4 times 9, that's $30 an acre that we're losing just in water. So, if you could catch them all at 13%, and ideally the first time they're at 13%, not the fourth time they're at 13%, that's where yield is maximized. Actually, that's not even true. Yield would be maximized probably at 15 or 16%, but it's really hard to catch them there. To do that in this day and age, you'd have to be doing some sort of defoliant, and there are guys that are playing with that, trying to trying to get the plant drier faster because the grain dries faster than the plant. So the grain is always ready to harvest before the plant is. So the purpose of a desiccant or a defoliant would be to kill the plant, desiccate the plant, dry the plant out faster, more like the grain dries. And then you can harvest more beans at 14, 15%. The first time they're at 14, 15%. And that's where you're going to get the maximum yields. So if you're, another thing that, and we talked last two weeks ago about all the invalid yield comparisons that we tend to make. If you started, harvesting your, let's say your early bean was a 3.3, planted, April 10th, and you cut those a month ago at 14% and they made 90. And now you're working on 3/8 planted May 15th. They've been ready to cut for a month, but we've been busy doing other stuff. So now you're cutting them at 9% and they're making 70. And you're looking at that, well, shit, that's 20 bushel. That's unacceptable. You got lots of differences there. You got a huge planting date difference. You got a huge maturity difference. You got a huge moisture difference. You got, probably more yield loss here than you do up here. This one had no chance to yield 90 because of the planting date. And then you throw all that other stuff in there and all of a sudden, you got this huge yield difference that's like, well, I can't tolerate that. Well, it's unavoidable in a lot of ways because, you can't plant every acre on April 10th. And if you ever did do that, May 15th would have been the best day to plant that year. That's just the way Murphy's Law works. You don't want to plant every acre on one day because you never know what day is going to be the good day to plant. And just the way, if your luck's like mine, if you ever did get every acre planted on one day, it would have been the worst day of the spring to plant if you did that. So, it just, you got to take the good with the bad. Instead of being mad about the 70, be thankful for the 90 because 90 is not normal. We can't count on 90 bushel beans year in and year out. Even if you plant in April, you got to have a lot of things working for you. You got to have the right bean. You got to have the right management. You got to have the right opportunity to plant them early. And then you got to have the right weather too. And April beans are not weatherproofed. You can't raise 90 bushel beans, even if you plant them April 10th, even if they're a good bean, even if you're a good manager, if you don't get some help from the weather. So you gotta kind of have all the pieces of the puzzle to get those kind of yields. And I don't know that we're always going to have all the pieces of the puzzle to get those kind of yields. So 90 bushel beans are easy to get used to, but try not to because it's just it's like 300 bushel corn. That's easy to get used to too, but it's not always going to work out that way. Okay, so we talked about soybean diseases. We talked about soybean moisture and yield. We talked about May versus April. Got a few more pictures I want to show. One thing that hasn't come up too much, and I debated whether I even wanted to call this out or not, but there is some potential grain quality stuff going on in corn, primarily in the May planted corn, and something to watch for would be cobs that look like that. Definite see the discoloration of the end of the tip of that cob. That was a beautiful ear of corn before I shelled it off. You couldn't see anything looking at the grain that would tip you into that, give you a tip that there's a problem there. The end of that cob's not particularly spongy, and those kernels were pretty well fully formed and normal looking kernels. But there is some gibberella ear rot out there, and that's probably what's causing that. That's the same pathogen that causes head scab in wheat. And there are some toxins associated with that. So if you happen to find a field where you're seeing a lot of cobs that look like that, you're seeing a lot of ear tips that don't look perfectly healthy, that would be good grain to move it right along and not stick it in a bin. So there is a little bit of that out there. It's not super hybrid specific, but like everything else in the world, genetics do matter. And so you might see hybrid differences. The main thing we're seeing is planting date differences. And typically you need to have some drought stress late during grain fill, and you have to have a lot of moisture at flowering time. So what do we have this year? Rain all the month of July. I mean, there was not any corn in Illinois that wasn't well irrigated around flowering time. And then it got dry late, and this May corn went through a lot of late drought stress. And so, the May corn, we talked about the May beans not keeping up with the April beans. Well, the May corn generally is not keeping up with the April corn, and that's a combination of aphids, late drought, maybe more wind damage. There's lots of, the May corn's got a better stand. The May corn, had more probably potential, but it didn't live up to the potential because the environment wasn't as good for corn that was maturing later in the season as it was corn that was maturing earlier in the season. Let's see if there was anything else that I wanted to show you. Oh, I'll show you that one. So there's what. Ooh. There's what I want my May corn to look like. Got the other day. That field is pretty green yet. So I got a picture here that shows there you can see some of the green. So that stuff's still 22%. Nothing fluffing at the head there. That's doing about 300 in that spot. Aphids didn't find that one. So that's what I want my May corn to be, but not always going to be that. We talked about stink bugs a lot this year, and I've got I marked 10 plants in a field. I haven't shelled these ears off yet, but if you wonder how stink bug plants turn out, so each of those different stakes was marking a plant, and all those plants had stink bug damage. Now, some of them were more severely damaged than others, and I'm going to go way out on a limb and say that plant 3 and plant 5 were probably more damaged than plant 4. But if you compare them to 3 ears from undamaged plants, you can see a lot of those plants that were showing stink bug damage do not have 100% yield potential. Now, only about 20% of the plants in this field, 15 to 20%, were showing stink bug damage, but that's pretty high. Cal was telling me he was usually more like 3 to 5%. He didn't have any of the 15 to 20% fields. But on those affected plants, I think the yield loss is probably close to 25%. But if you're only losing 25% of your yield on 5% of your plants, that's kind of a pretty small hit. But if you're losing 25% of your yield on 20% of your plants, well, then that's a little easier to calculate. So it was kind of a bad bug year. We've talked about that a lot, from alfalfa weevils to cutworms in some cases to stink bugs to, some people had pretty good Japanese beetle pressure. A lot of corn rootworm beetles were observed this year. Then obviously we had the aphids. Aphids turned out to be the biggest, yield robbing pest this year. And I don't know, how much the mild winter played into any of that, but I was talking to somebody the other day, and they saw a woolly bear caterpillar that was like all black. And so they're like, bring it on, bring it on. We need a really, really hard winter. We need to kill some insects. So I don't, some insects are pretty, like rootworm, for example. I mean, rootworm do well in Minnesota. It gets cold up there. So, I mean, you're not going to kill rootworm when it's cold. You kill rootworm when it's wet. And that's bad for other things too. So you don't want to wish for a saturated wet May just to drown rootworm larvae, although it is highly effective at that. But it's also bad for corn, bad for nitrogen, bad for getting work done. It's not a good thing to wish for. But anyway, I'm hoping for kind of lower insect pressure next year than what we dealt with this year, because in 1 year, for whatever reason, I've never seen alfalfa weevil that bad. I've never seen stink bug that bad. I've never seen aphids that bad. All three of those pests, to me, this was kind of like a record bad year all in 1 year. So that it was a cicada year too. That turned out to be kind of not that big a deal. But maybe if you were looking for it, maybe it was is obvious, but I didn't really particularly notice it was that much different than normal. But luckily, they're not a crop pest either, so we didn't have to deal with that in the crops. So I don't think have any questions come in on the chat this morning, Adam. I haven't noticed anything.
Text comments, nothing in the chat.
Okay, all right. So appreciate you all staying with us here this morning. We'll go ahead and wrap up a little bit early since we started late anyway. Those of you that are watching it recorded, you didn't know that we started late because you don't care when we start. You watch it whenever it's convenient for you. So that's Jennifer made a good suggestion that we needed to reboot the computer this morning, and it's better to start late than it is to start with bad technology and have it glitching and crashing, and we've learned that the hard way that's pretty painful. So very good recommendation, Jennifer, to take the time to reboot the machine, and things went smoothly. So
be back on Halloween.
Oh, cool! That's my daughter Audrey's birthday. So I've got an angel that was born on Devil's Day, so we'll be back with you Halloween, Adam says, and I think we got through everything I was going to go through on the list this morning. So one quick reminder, we're getting close to anhydrous season. Probably going to be somebody out there trying to say it's already anhydrous season. We've had a little bit of cold weather. There's warm weather coming next week. I think the biggest challenge we're going to have is soil moisture. If you've done any fall tillage, you're going to need some rain before you're putting any anhydrous on that ground. It's just not going to seal. If you've got untouched bean stubble, there might be enough moisture in that to get a good seal. But hopefully we get some rain, so we've got some decent soil moisture, so we can get our fall nitrogen applications made. But just be careful with that. If it's too dry, there's not a damn thing you can do about that. But if it's too dry, putting it on anyway would be a bad idea. So make sure you're getting a good seal when you get out there with anhydrous. Maybe you can go a little deeper and accomplish that. If you're thinking about doing fall tillage first, you might want to think about that, because if you rip that ground, you're going to absolutely have to have some good soaking rains on that before you're doing any fall nitrogen. So you might have to pick your poison there. Which operation would you rather get done? Because if we don't start getting some rain, it's going to be hard to do both of those. So anyway, stay safe, and we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Thanks.